The iron gates towered above me like the bars of a cage I was willingly walking into, and something cold slithered down my spine as the security camera swiveled to track my approach. I told myself it was just nerves. Rich people had security. Rich people had cameras and guards and estates that looked more like fortresses than homes. Diana had promised me this would be easy money, a simple overnight babysitting job for a businessman who traveled frequently and paid triple the normal rate. I needed the rent money too badly to question the details. The gate groaned open without my pressing any buzzer, and I walked up the winding drive with my overnight bag clutched against my chest like a shield. The mansion materialized through the manicured hedges, all gray stone and Gothic arches and windows that watched me like dozens of dark eyes. A man in a black suit stood at the front door, his posture military straight, his face betraying nothing as he held the door open for me. Inside, the housekeeper greeted me with a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Mrs. Crane, she said her name was, her voice crisp and efficient, as she led me through marble hallways lined with artwork that probably cost more than my entire graduate school tuition. I noticed 3 more cameras before we reached the parlor where the children waited. The twins sat side by side on a velvet settee, perfectly still, watching me enter with expressions far too composed for 7-year-olds. Sophia had dark hair pulled back in a ribbon, her blue eyes assessing me like I was a puzzle she intended to solve. Thomas looked nearly identical to his sister, but something in his gaze felt older, knowing. They said nothing. They simply watched. Then he appeared in the doorway behind me, and I understood immediately why the air in the room changed. Alexander Sinclair was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. His dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged on magazine covers or wanted posters, all sharp angles and shadowed intensity. His eyes found mine, gray as winter storms, and I felt pinned in place like a butterfly under glass. Devastatingly handsome, coldly polite. The words formed in my mind unbidden. He crossed the room in 3 strides and shook my hand briefly, his grip firm, his skin warm against my suddenly cold fingers. He gave me instructions in clipped sentences. Bedtime at 8, no sugar after 6, emergency numbers on the refrigerator. He would return by morning. He kissed each of his children on the forehead with a tenderness that seemed at odds with everything else about him. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the twins and the unsettling certainty that I was being watched from every angle. Sophia tilted her head slightly, studying me. Thomas glanced at his sister, and something passed between them, some unspoken communication I could not decipher. A knowing look, a secret shared. The gilded cage closed around me, and I smiled at the children as if nothing was wrong at all. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The twins played with me the way a cat plays with a mouse it has not yet decided to kill. We sat in the nursery surrounded by toys that looked barely touched, expensive dolls in elaborate train sets and books with gold-leafed pages, and Sophia arranged a tea party with movements so precise they seemed rehearsed. Thomas watched from the window seat, his small hands folded in his lap, his eyes tracking my every gesture. They asked me questions between sips of imaginary tea, questions that felt like tests. Would you ever tell someone else's secret, Miss Eleanor? If someone trusted you with something important, would you keep it safe? What would you do if you found out something you were not supposed to know? I answered carefully, sensing tripwires in every word, and their expressions gave nothing away. When the clock struck 7, they announced it was their quiet time, and they retreated to their rooms with the synchronized movements of soldiers following orders. I wandered the mansion alone, telling myself I was simply stretching my legs, but my feet carried me toward the questions multiplying in my mind. The east wing was locked, a heavy wooden door that did not budge when I tried the handle, and I noticed scratches around the keyhole as if it was frequently used. I passed a room where 3 men in suits huddled around a table covered in papers, their voices dropping to silence the moment they saw me. One of them smiled, but his eyes stayed cold and flat, and he closed the door before I could see what lay spread across that table. Another room held nothing but screens, dozens of them, showing every angle of the estate in flickering black and white. The gardens, the gates, the hallway where I stood. I saw myself on one of the monitors, small and out of place, and I stepped back quickly as if caught doing something forbidden. Then I heard the voice. It came from somewhere nearby, filtered through walls but still audible, and the tone made my blood slow in my veins. Cold, commanding, the kind of voice that expected obedience and received it without question. I pressed myself against the wall and listened, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The shipment arrives at midnight," the voice said. "If there are any problems, I want an example made. I want them to remember what happens when someone crosses us." The words carved themselves into my brain. Shipment, example, crosses us. I told myself there were innocent explanations. Import business, strict corporate policies. Wealthy people talked differently, lived differently, operated by rules I did not understand. I almost believed it. Then I turned and found the twins standing at the end of the hallway, watching me with those ancient eyes, and my excuses crumbled to dust. Sophia tilted her head. Thomas stepped forward. "Do you know how to keep secrets, Miss Eleanor?" he asked, and the question sounded nothing like a question at all. The clock in the hallway chimed 12 times, each strike resonating through the silent mansion like a warning bell, and I crept down the corridor toward the twins' room because something would not let me sleep. I told myself I was being responsible, checking on the children one last time, but the truth was that Thomas's question had burrowed under my skin and made a home there, festering alongside every strange thing I had witnessed since walking through those iron gates. The nursery door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open expecting to find 2 small shapes sleeping peacefully beneath expensive linens. Instead, I found them sitting upright in the darkness, side by side on Sophia's bed, their pale faces turned toward me as if they had been waiting. Sophia beckoned me closer with one small hand, and my feet carried me forward even as every instinct screamed at me to turn around and pretend I had seen nothing. I knelt beside the bed, and the twins leaned in close, their breath warm against my ear, and Sophia whispered 4 words that shattered the fragile lies I had been telling myself all evening. "Dad's a mafia boss." I laughed, the sound high and nervous and completely unconvincing, and I started to say that was quite an imagination they had, but Thomas gripped my wrist with surprising strength, and his eyes in the darkness were not the eyes of a child playing pretend. "We've seen things," he said, his voice barely audible. "Men come to the house late at night, and they don't leave the same way they came." We found a room once with maps and photographs of people and red X marks through some of the faces. We hear Father on the phone talking about shipments and territories and making people disappear. The words tumbled out of them in tandem, Sophia and Thomas trading sentences like a rehearsed confession, and with each revelation my heart beat faster and my skin grew colder. They told me about guards who carried guns beneath their jackets and basement rooms that were always locked, and the way their father's voice changed when he talked to certain men, becoming something sharp and terrible that did not match the man who kissed them goodnight. They told me about the last nanny, a woman named Catherine who had been kind to them, who had stayed for 3 months before she started asking questions about the locked rooms and the late-night visitors. "She went away," Sophia whispered, and her small fingers found mine in the darkness. "Father said she found another job far away, but we never got to say goodbye, and her things disappeared overnight, and no one ever spoke her name again." Terror crystallized in my chest, cold and sharp, spreading through my veins like ice water. I wanted to run, but I could feel the weight of all those cameras, all those guards, all those locked doors standing between me and freedom. I was trapped in this beautiful prison until morning at least. and maybe much longer than that. The twins watched my fear with something that looked almost like relief, as if my terror validated their truth. "You believe us," Thomas said. I nodded because I could not speak. Then they heard it too, all three of us freezing at the same moment. Footsteps approaching down the hallway, slow and deliberate, growing closer with each heartbeat. The door swung open and Alexander Sinclair filled the frame, his presence flooding the room like a dark tide, and the twins transformed so quickly I almost doubted what I had witnessed seconds before. Their bodies went limp, their breathing deepened, their faces smoothed into masks of innocent sleep, and I marveled at how children so young had learned to deceive so completely. Alexander's gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. Lingering on my kneeling position beside Sophia's bed, on my hand still trembling slightly where Thomas had gripped it, on the rapid rise and fall of my chest that betrayed my terror. "You're in their room quite late, Miss Bennet." His voice was silk over steel, pleasant enough on the surface, but carrying an edge that made my spine straighten involuntarily. I stood too quickly, my knees protesting, and I heard myself stammering something about nightmares, about hearing sounds and wanting to check on the children, and even to my own ears the excuse sounded thin and unconvincing. He stepped into the room and the space shrank around him, the shadows deepening as if they bent toward his presence, and I found myself backing up until my shoulders hit the wall. He moved closer still, not stopping until barely a foot separated us, until I could smell expensive cologne and something darker underneath, something that reminded me of smoke and winter and danger. His eyes searched my face with an intensity that felt like being dissected, like he was peeling back layers of skin and bone to examine the terrified thoughts racing through my skull. "What did my children tell you?" he asked, and the question landed like a blade between my ribs. "Nothing important," I whispered, and the lie tasted like ash on my tongue. "Just stories, children's imagination. You know how they make things up." He studied me for a long moment that stretched into eternity, and I watched him weigh my words against everything else he observed, the calculation behind his eyes cold and precise as a machine designed for detecting weakness. He knew I was lying. I could see it in the slight narrowing of his gaze, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the way his head tilted as if considering exactly how much of a problem I had become. But instead of pressing harder, instead of demanding truth I was too frightened to give, he stepped back and the pressure in the room eased just enough for me to draw breath. "Curiosity is dangerous here, Miss Bennet," he said, and his voice was quiet now, almost gentle, which somehow made the words more terrifying. "I suggest you focus on the children and forget anything else you think you might have seen or heard. Some doors are locked for good reason." He turned and walked out without waiting for a response, and I stood frozen against the wall long after his footsteps faded, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs from the inside. I made my way to the guest room on legs that felt like water, my mind racing through escape plans that crumbled as quickly as I built them, and when I finally reached for my phone to call for help, to call anyone, the screen showed what I had dreaded most: no signal, no connection, no way out. I waited until the house grew quiet, until the footsteps in the hallway faded and the guards settled into their positions, and then I moved. The window in my guest room was my first hope, but when I examined the frame, I found sensors embedded in the wood, tiny electronic eyes that would scream my betrayal the moment I lifted the glass. The door to the garden was my second attempt, and I crept down the back stairs with my shoes in my hand, my bare feet silent on the cold marble. But two guards stood smoking in the moonlight just beyond the glass, their silhouettes dark against the manicured hedges. I tried 3 more doors, then 4, each one locked, or watched, or both. And with every failed escape, my panic climbed higher in my throat until I could taste it, metallic and sharp like blood. The front gates were impossible, 20 feet of iron and surveillance, and even if I somehow scaled the walls, the cameras would track me, and the men would follow, and I would become another story, the twins whispered to the next nanny in the dark. I returned to my room defeated, my mind racing through options that did not exist, and I found I was not alone. He sat in the armchair by the window, long legs crossed at the ankle, his posture casual, but his eyes anything but. Marcus Ashworth, the man I had seen shadowing Alexander since I arrived, the one the other staff treated with careful deference that bordered on fear. He was handsome in a sharp-featured way, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been kind if not for the emptiness behind his smile. "Miss Bennet," he said, and his voice was pleasant, almost friendly, which made it worse. "Going somewhere?" I considered lying, but the evidence of my attempted flight was written across my disheveled appearance, my bare feet, the shoes still clutched in my trembling hands. He gestured for me to sit, and I did, because I could not think of what else to do. He explained the situation with the patience of a man who had delivered similar speeches before. I had been hired for a week. I would stay for a week. Leaving early would raise questions that Mr. Sinclair preferred to avoid. Questions about what I had seen and heard, and what I might tell the wrong people. I asked him directly, my voice steadier than I felt. "What happens to people who know too much?" His smile widened, but did not warm. "That depends entirely on their choices, Miss Bennet, on their discretion, on their ability to recognize that some opportunities are better than others." He stood, smoothing his jacket, and moved toward the door with the fluid grace of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "I should mention," he added, pausing at the threshold, "that Mr. Sinclair has taken a particular interest in you. Whether that interest proves fortunate or unfortunate is entirely in your hands." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a lock engaging, like a fate being sealed, and I sat in the darkness understanding finally and completely that I was no longer a babysitter. I was a prisoner waiting to learn my sentence. The days blurred into a strange rhythm of captivity and domesticity, and I found myself settling into the role of caretaker with a resignation that frightened me almost as much as the locked doors and watchful guards. Sophia and Thomas had abandoned their unsettling formality, replacing it with the genuine neediness of children who had learned too young that people leave, and their small hands reaching for mine during breakfast, or their bodies pressed against my sides during story time, began to feel less like obligation and more like anchoring. I taught them card games my grandmother had taught me, braided Sophia's dark hair into elaborate crowns she admired in every mirror we passed, helped Thomas with arithmetic that seemed too advanced for a 7-year-old until I remembered who his father was and what empire he would one day inherit. Alexander appeared at odd moments, a shadow in doorways, a presence at the edge of rooms, watching with those piercing eyes that never seemed to blink. I learned to sense him before I saw him, a prickling awareness along my skin that announced his proximity like a warning signal my body could not ignore. He joined us for dinner on the 4th evening, sitting at the head of the long table while the twins chattered about their day with an enthusiasm they had never shown when he was absent, and I watched him listen with an attention that seemed to cost him something, as if being present for small joys required effort he could barely spare. Afterward, I read to the children in the library, their heads growing heavy against my shoulders as the story wound toward its ending, and I looked up to find him standing in the doorway with an expression I could not name, something soft and aching beneath his usual mask of control. He did not leave when I finished, instead helping me carry his sleeping children to their beds, his hands impossibly gentle as he tucked blankets around small bodies and pressed kisses to foreheads that would not remember them in the morning. We walked back to the library in silence that felt different from before, less like a predator stalking prey, and more like two people circling a fire neither wanted to name. He poured whiskey from a crystal decanter and offered me a glass I accepted because refusing seemed more intimate than taking it, and we sat in leather chairs that smelled of old books and money while the fire crackled between us. He asked about the twins and I told him the truth, that they were brilliant and strange and desperately hungry for stability they pretended not to need. Something flickered in his jaw, acknowledgement or guilt or both, and he made a comment so dry about the inadequacy of nannies that I laughed before I could stop myself, startled by humor where I expected only threat. He smiled then, just barely, and the transformation of his face hit me like a blow to the chest because he was beautiful when he was not trying to terrify. And I hated myself for noticing, for caring, for wanting to see that smile again. I reached for a book on the table between us at the same moment he did, and our fingers brushed, his skin warm against mine, and every nerve ending in my body ignited with awareness I had no right to feel. I pulled back too quickly, and he watched me with eyes that saw too much. "You are not what I expected, Eleanor," he said, and my name in his mouth without the formal miss, before it sounded like something dangerous, something that could ruin me if I let it. The sirens woke me, a sound I had never heard inside this fortress of silence and secrets, and for 3 heartbeats I lay frozen in the darkness, trying to understand what had shattered the careful quiet of the Sinclair estate. Then the shouting started, men's voices raised in alarm and command, and I was moving before my mind caught up with my body, my bare feet hitting cold floor as I ran toward the only thing that mattered in that moment of chaos. The twins' room was down the hall, and I burst through their door to find them already awake, Sophia clutching her stuffed rabbit with white-knuckled hands, and Thomas standing in front of his sister like a soldier awaiting orders. And the look in his eyes when he saw me was not fear, but calculation. A child forced too young into understanding that danger was not abstract but real, and coming closer with every passing second. "This way," Thomas said, and he grabbed my hand and pulled me toward a bookshelf that should not have moved but did, revealing a narrow passage and a room beyond made of steel and shadows. I lifted Sophia into my arms, and we crowded into the panic room together, the door sealing behind us with a hiss that sounded like safety and felt like burial, and in the darkness I could hear the gunfire beginning, sharp cracks that echoed through the walls like the house itself was screaming. Sophia sobbed against my neck, her small body shaking with terror she could not contain, and I held her tighter while Thomas pressed against my side, his hand finding mine and squeezing with strength that surprised me. I did not know how long we waited in that metal womb, time stretching and compressing until minutes felt like hours and hours like years, and I thought about Alexander out there in the violence, wondered if he was alive or dying or already gone, and the fear I felt was not the fear of a prisoner for her captor, but something else entirely, something that clawed at my chest and made it hard to breathe. When the door finally opened, I pushed the children behind me, ready to fight, ready to die protecting these small lives that had somehow become precious to me. But the figure in the doorway was not an enemy. Alexander stood there covered in blood, some of it his and some of it not, his suit torn and his face a mask of barely controlled fury, and when his eyes found his children, something in that mask cracked open to reveal the father beneath the monster. He crossed the room in 2 strides and fell to his knees, gathering Sophia and Thomas against him with arms that trembled. And I watched this man who commanded empires hold his children like they were the only empire that mattered. Then he looked up at me, this woman who was supposed to be nothing but a complication, and in his gaze I saw something I had never expected to find there, something raw and grateful and terrifying in its intensity. "You protected them," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he could not quite suppress. "I will not forget that, Eleanor. I will never forget what you did tonight." The children slept at last, exhausted by terror and the strange relief that comes after survival, and I found Alexander in his study with blood still drying on his shirt and his hands pressed flat against his desk, as if the solid wood was the only thing keeping him upright. I should have left him alone, should have retreated to my room and locked the door, and tried to forget the way he had looked at me in that panic room. But instead, I heard myself saying that he needed those wounds cleaned before infection set in. And when he started to refuse, I cut him off with a firmness that surprised us both. "Sit down," I said, And something in my voice must have carried an authority I did not feel because he sat, lowering himself into the leather chair behind his desk, with a weariness that made him look older than his 34 years. I gathered supplies from the bathroom, antiseptic and bandages and clean cloths, and when I returned, he had removed his ruined jacket and was working at the buttons of his shirt with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Let me," I said, and my fingers replaced his, unfastening each button with a steadiness born of deliberate focus. And when the fabric fell away, I saw the map of violence written across his skin, the fresh gash on his shoulder still seeping red alongside older scars that told stories I could only imagine. I worked in silence at first, cleaning the wounds with careful hands while he watched my face with an intensity that made my cheeks burn, and the intimacy of the moment pressed against my chest like a physical weight, because this was something lovers did, something wives did, not captive babysitters who had stumbled into a world they never asked to enter. "How did you become this?" I asked without meaning to, and the question hung between us like smoke until he answered with fragments, with pieces of a history as sharp and broken as the glass I had heard shattering hours before. A father who built an empire on blood and called it legacy. A mother who died when he was too young to understand. A wife who came later and left too soon in a car accident that may not have been an accident at all. "The twins are everything," he said, and his voice cracked on the word in a way that made my hands still against his skin. "They are the only good thing I have ever done, the only reason any of this matters." I told him about my own losses then, about a father who drank himself to death, and a mother who followed him into the grave 2 years later, about working 3 jobs to put myself through school and never quite feeling like I belonged anywhere. We were two wounded creatures recognizing our own damage in each other, and when I finished bandaging the gash on his shoulder, my hands lingered against his skin longer than necessary. He caught my wrist then, gently, his fingers circling the delicate bones with a touch that was almost tender. "You should fear me, Eleanor," he said, and his eyes were dark with something that looked like warning and wanting all tangled together. "I know," I whispered, but I did not pull away. He found me in the garden the next morning, standing among roses that cost more than my monthly rent, and when he spoke my name, I turned to find him watching me with an expression I could not quite read, something caught between resolve and reluctance. "I need to tell you something," he said, and the formality in his voice made my stomach tighten with dread, because I had learned that Alexander Sinclair only spoke this carefully when the words mattered too much for carelessness. "You can leave," he said, and for a moment I was certain I had misheard him, certain that the man who had kept me prisoner for days was not now offering me the key to my cage. He explained it all in that measured voice, how he would arrange transport, how he would pay me enough to disappear somewhere safe, how he would ensure that his world never touched my life again, and as he spoke, I searched his face for the trap, for the trick, for the threat hidden beneath the offer, but found only sincerity and something that looked almost like pain. The logical part of my mind screamed at me to accept, to run back to my empty apartment and my struggling existence and my safe, ordinary life, where men did not kill and children did not whisper secrets in the dark. But even as logic screamed, my heart whispered something different, something terrifying and true. I asked for time, and he gave it without hesitation, nodding once and stepping back as if my answer did not matter when we both knew it mattered more than either of us could admit. That night, I walked the grounds with Marcus trailing behind me like a shadow I could not shake. And I thought about what waited for me beyond those iron gates, thought about the apartment where no one waited for me to come home, the university where I was just another face in a crowd of ambition, the life I had built from nothing that somehow felt like less than nothing now. I thought about Diana, who had recommended me for this job without knowing what she was sending me into. Wondered if I could ever explain what had happened here without sounding insane, without losing the only friend I had left in a world that had taken so much from me already. The twins had cried when I mentioned leaving, Sophia clinging to my legs, and Thomas trying so hard to be brave while his eyes begged me to stay. And I had promised them nothing, because I did not know what promises I could keep. But as I walked through Alexander's garden with stars scattered overhead like diamonds on black velvet, I found myself remembering not the fear, but the moment in the panic room when the door had opened and I had seen him standing there, bloodied and broken, and looking at me like I had given him something precious. I remembered his hands trembling as he held his children, remembered the crack in his voice when he spoke of his dead wife, remembered the way he had said you should fear me like it was a confession and a plea all tangled together. I was afraid, that much was true, and would perhaps always be true. But somewhere in the darkness of that garden, I realized that I was more afraid of leaving than staying, more afraid of returning to a life where no one looked at me the way Alexander did, like I was both his salvation and his destruction. I did not want to go, and that terrified me more than anything else. The envelope arrived at breakfast, slid across the table by Marcus, whose face had gone carefully blank in the way I had learned meant something terrible. And when Alexander opened it, the photograph spilled out like poison. Image after image of my old life spread across the polished wood for everyone to see. There I was outside my apartment building with my keys in my hand. There I was walking to campus with my bag over my shoulder. There I was laughing with Diana at our favorite coffee shop, and the violation of it made my stomach lurch because someone had been watching me, hunting me, cataloging my movements long before I ever set foot in this house. Alexander's hand closed around the photograph so hard the edges crumpled, and when he looked up his eyes were blazing with a fury that made the air itself feel dangerous, made me want to step back even though I knew, somehow knew, that his rage was not directed at me. Ravenscroft, he said, and the name came out like a curse, like a death sentence already signed and sealed. He rose from the table and began to pace, every movement controlled and predatory, a caged wolf calculating the distance to his prey, and I watched him with my heart hammering against my ribs because I understood now what those photographs meant, understood that my normal life had ceased to exist the moment I walked through his gates. He explained it in clipped sentences, each word sharp as a blade, how Ravenscroft had been gathering information, building leverage, preparing to use anyone close to Alexander as a weapon against him. "You cannot go back," he said, and there was something almost like anguish beneath the cold certainty in his voice. "The moment you step outside my protection, he will find you, he will take you, and he will use you to destroy everything I have built, including you." I thought of Diana, of her bright smile and terrible taste in men, and the way she always knew when I needed to talk, and fear for her clawed at my throat until Alexander added that he had already sent people to watch her, to keep her safe without her knowledge, to ensure that Ravenscroft could not touch her either. The walls were closing in. I could feel them pressing against my skin, and yet when I looked at Alexander, I saw not the jailer I had once thought him, but something else entirely, something raw and terrified that had nothing to do with his empire or his enemies. He was afraid for me, genuinely afraid, and the realization cracked something open in my chest, because this was not possession, not control, not the cold calculation of a man protecting his assets. This was fear, pure and human and desperate, the same fear I had felt in that panic room with his children in my arms. He crossed the distance between us in 3 long strides and took my face in his hands, his palms warm against my cheeks, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "I will end anyone who touches you," he said, and it was not a threat, but a vow, sacred and terrible and absolute. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors bleeding into one another, each day pulling me deeper into a life I had never imagined, and a man I could not resist no matter how many times I reminded myself of the danger he represented. Alexander began teaching me self-defense in the gymnasium hidden in the East Wing, and every session became its own exquisite torture as his hands guided my arms into position, as his body pressed against my back to correct my stance, as his breath warmed my ear while he murmured instructions that I could barely hear over the thundering of my own pulse. The twins started calling me Eleanor instead of Miss Bennet, and the first time Sophia slipped and called me Ellie the way Diana always did, something cracked open in my chest, and I had to turn away so no one would see the tears burning in my eyes. I learned the rhythms of this strange household, learned which guards would nod at me in the hallways and which ones would smile, learned that Marcus had a daughter he never saw and that the cook had worked for Alexander's father before him. I learned that Alexander took his coffee black and bitter, that he read poetry in the original French, that he checked on his children every night no matter how late his business kept him. And I learned that I watched for him constantly, that my body had become attuned to his presence like a compass needle finding north, that the sound of his voice in another room could make my heart stutter in ways I could not control. One night, he found me in the library at 2 a.m, unable to sleep, and instead of leaving, he settled into the chair across from mine and asked what I was reading. We talked until the sky began to lighten, about books and loss and the people we had been, before life broke us and remade us into something harder. He told me about his wife, how she had been kind in ways he did not deserve, how her death had frozen something inside him that he thought would never thaw. I told him about my parents, about the accident that took them, about building myself from nothing, because there was no one left to build me. When sunrise finally broke through the tall windows and painted everything in shades of gold and rose, he crossed the space between us and cupped my face in his hands the way he had before. But this time when he leaned down, it was not a vow he was offering but a question, his lips hovering above mine, waiting, asking permission without words. I answered by rising onto my toes and closing the distance myself. And the kiss that followed was everything I had feared, and everything I had wanted, tender and desperate and terrifying in its intensity. When we finally broke apart, he pressed his forehead to mine, and I felt him trembling, this man who commanded armies and ended lives trembling against me like I had undone him completely. "I am terrified of caring this much," he whispered, and the confession broke something inside me and rebuilt it in the same breath. "Then we are both terrified," I said. And somehow that shared fear felt like the beginning of something neither of us could name. The security breach came not from the gates or the walls, but from within, a betrayal that slithered through the house like poison through veins. And when Marcus brought the evidence to Alexander, I watched the transformation happen in real time, watched the man who had kissed me at sunrise become something else entirely, something cold and ancient and terrifying. The traitor was a guard named Jensen, a man with kind eyes and a gentle voice who had always smiled at me in the hallways, who had once brought me tea when I was sitting alone in the garden, who had told me stories about his family back in the city. I had trusted him. I had thought he was safe. And now Marcus was showing Alexander photographs, documents, recordings that proved Jensen had been feeding information to Ravenscroft for months, had told him about the attack, about the defenses, about me. Alexander listened to the evidence without expression, his face carved from marble, his eyes chips of frozen sea, and when Marcus finished speaking, Alexander simply nodded once and said, "Handle it." 2 words, just 2 words, spoken in a voice that held no emotion at all, and I knew with sickening certainty what those words meant, what fate had been sealed with that quiet command. I found Alexander in his study an hour later, standing at the window with a glass of something amber in his hand, and when he turned to face me, I saw no trace of the man who had trembled against me in the library, no trace of the father who read bedtime stories, or the lover who had asked permission with his eyes before kissing me. This was the other Alexander, the one who built empires on blood and fear, the one who could order a man's death with less emotion than most people ordered coffee. "How can you do that?" I asked, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "How can you just decide someone dies and then pour yourself a drink like nothing happened?" He studied me for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes, That might have been pain, or might have been disappointment. Jensen endangered my children, he said. He endangered you. He sold our location, our weaknesses, our routines to a man who would burn this house to the ground with everyone inside if it served his purposes. What would you have me do, Eleanor? Send him to prison where Ravenscroft would have him killed anyway? Or worse, freed to try again? I did not have an answer. That was the terrible truth of it. I had no answer because this world operated on rules I was only beginning to understand, rules written in violence and paid for in blood. Mercy gets people killed, Alexander said, and he crossed to where I stood and took my face in his hands the way he always did. His thumbs tracing my cheekbones with a gentleness that seemed impossible given what he had just ordered. I am not a good man. I have never pretended to be. But I protect what is mine, Eleanor, and you must decide if you can accept that, all of that, or if you cannot. I stayed. I made my choice in the quiet hours of that night, alone in my room with the weight of everything I had witnessed pressing down on my chest, and when morning came I found Alexander in his study, and told him that I was not leaving, not now, not ever, but that I had conditions, and he would hear them whether he liked it or not. He looked at me with something that might have been surprise, might have been amusement, might have been the beginning of respect, and he gestured for me to continue. I will not be kept in the dark, I said, and my voice was steady, even though my hands were shaking at my sides. I will not be protected like a porcelain doll on a shelf, locked away while you make decisions that affect my life without consulting me. If I am going to be part of this, if I am going to love you and stay with you and help raise your children in this world you have built, then I need to understand it. I need to be a partner, not a possession. He was silent for a long time, his jaw tight, his eyes searching my face for something I could not name. Then slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. In the days that followed, he began to teach me, not just self-defense, but the architecture of his empire, the players and the politics, the territories and the truces. I learned about supply chains and distribution networks, about the coded language they used, and the signals that meant danger was coming. And I started to see patterns that his people, who had been in this world so long they had become blind to certain things, could not see. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I noticed it, sitting in the security room with Marcus while Alexander was in a meeting. I had been studying Ravenscroft's movements for days, the photographs and reports and intercepted communications that painted a picture of a man preparing for war. Everyone assumed the strike would come from the east, through the shipping routes Ravenscroft controlled. But something about the timing felt wrong to me. Something about the way his men had been moving through the city in seemingly random patterns that were not random at all if you looked at them the right way. I pulled up a map and started marking locations, dates, times, and when I stepped back, the pattern emerged like a constellation forming from scattered stars. He is not coming from the east, I said, and Marcus looked at me like I had lost my mind. He is coming through the financial district, through the legitimate businesses, using our own supply lines against us. The meeting Alexander was in ended abruptly when Marcus delivered my analysis, and when Alexander looked at me across the table, something fundamental shifted in his eyes, something that went beyond desire or affection into territory I had never seen before. "You brilliant woman," he said quietly, and the words wrapped around me like armor. That night when he reached for me, it was different. The kiss of a man who saw me clearly at last. The plan required me to become someone else entirely, to shed Eleanor Bennet like a snake sheds its skin, and become instead a woman scorned, a woman burning with hatred for Alexander Sinclair, a woman desperate enough to seek out his greatest enemy and offer herself as a weapon against him. I sat in the back of an unmarked car 3 blocks from Ravenscroft's club, with my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, wearing clothes that were not mine, and carrying documents that painted a picture of abuse and imprisonment, and a thirst for revenge that felt uncomfortably close to the truth I had once lived. Alexander had argued against this plan for hours, had paced his study like a caged wolf, and told me there had to be another way, But we both knew there was not, knew that Ravenscroft's security was too tight for a direct assault, and that the only way through was someone he would never suspect, someone soft and harmless and ordinary, someone like me. The first hour inside the club passed in a blur of careful lies and manufactured tears, of telling Ravenscroft's people a story about escaping the Sinclair estate with evidence that could destroy their enemy, and they believed me because I was nobody, because I looked exactly like what I pretended to be. When they brought me to Ravenscroft himself, I almost lost my nerve, almost crumbled under the weight of his cold reptilian gaze, and the smile that never reached his eyes. But I thought of the twins waiting at home, and I thought of Alexander trusting me with everything, and I held myself together through sheer force of will. The signal was supposed to come at midnight, a power outage that would give Alexander's people their opening, but something went wrong. The lights flickered but did not die, and suddenly Ravenscroft was looking at me with dawning suspicion, was reaching for me with hands that promised violence, and I had exactly 2 seconds to decide whether to run or fight. I chose to fight. Everything Alexander had taught me in those long afternoons of training came flooding back, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed, and I moved without thinking, striking at vulnerable points, creating distance, buying time I was not sure I had. Ravenscroft was faster than he looked, stronger, and when his hand closed around my throat, I thought, this is how it ends, thought at least I tried, thought I am sorry, Alexander. Then the wall exploded inward, and Alexander was there, a fury of controlled violence, moving through Ravenscroft's guards like a blade through silk, and when he reached the man who held me, his face was something beyond human, something ancient and terrible and beautiful in its wrath. The fight was brief and brutal. Ravenscroft fell. And then Alexander was pulling me against him, his hands running over my body checking for injuries, his breath ragged against my hair as he held me so tight it almost hurt. "Never again," he whispered, and his voice cracked on the words. "Never risk yourself like that again, Eleanor. I cannot lose you. I cannot." The weeks that followed Ravenscroft's fall brought a kind of peace I had never known. A settling of the constant tension that had lived beneath my skin since the first night I walked through those iron gates and felt the weight of surveillance pressing down on me like a physical thing. His organization crumbled without him, the lieutenants scattering like rats from a sinking ship, and Alexander's position solidified into something unshakable, a foundation of power built on the ashes of his enemies' ambitions. I watched him in those quiet days, saw how the rigid line of his shoulders slowly relaxed, how his smiles came easier and lasted longer, how he lingered at breakfast with the twins instead of rushing to his study to manage the latest crisis. And I realized that I had become part of the architecture of this life, woven into the daily rhythms of the Sinclair household so thoroughly that I could not imagine extracting myself without tearing something essential. The twins asked me on a Thursday morning, their faces serious in that way that always made them seem older than their 7 years, whether I was going to stay forever or if I would leave like the others. Sophia held my hand while she asked, and Thomas stood slightly behind her with his arms crossed, trying to look stern but failing to hide the vulnerability in his eyes. I told them that I was not going anywhere, and the way they both launched themselves at me, wrapping their small arms around my waist and holding on like I might disappear if they let go, broke something open in my chest that I had not known was still closed. That evening, Alexander found me in the garden, standing among the roses that his late wife had planted years ago, and when he approached there was something different in the way he moved, something that spoke of nerves and uncertainty that I had never seen in him before. He took my hands in his and looked at me with those gray eyes that had once seemed so cold and now felt like coming home, and he asked me the same question his children had asked, but with a weight behind it that made my breath catch in my throat. He produced a ring from his pocket, old and beautiful, diamonds surrounding a sapphire the color of midnight, and told me it had belonged to his grandmother, that Sophia and Thomas had helped him choose it from the family collection, that he knew this life was dangerous and complicated, and nothing like what I had imagined for myself, but that he could not imagine facing any of it without me beside him. I thought about my tiny apartment with its water stains on the ceiling, about the graduate program I had abandoned, about the ordinary future I had once believed I wanted. Then I looked at Alexander, at this man who commanded an empire with a word and trembled when he asked me to stay, and I said yes. Later I stood at the window watching him chase the twins across the lawn, their laughter carrying on the evening air, and I understood finally that some cages are homes in disguise, that the bars I had once feared were actually the framework of belonging. I placed my hand against the glass, the sapphire catching the fading light, and smiled at the dangerous, beautiful family I had chosen, my family now, forever.